An exciting new leak from Magic the Gathering's upcoming Dungeons & Dragons Adventure in the Forgotten Realms set has given us an exciting view into a brand new mechanic that revolves around the concept of exploring dungeons.
Magic. I am a wizard! History. I'm an old wizard! The magic historian. My bones hurt.
Greetings, owners of fine luxury cardboard rectangles. My friends, we are here to take a glimpse into the future and see what is coming down the road in terms of cards for the upcoming Dungeons & Dragons Adventures in the Forgotten Realm Magic the Gathering set. Now that is a massive mouthful. Half the time I start saying the name of the set, I'm not sure if I'm actually going to be able to make it through without getting all gobbledygooked up. So, before we dive into the main meat of what we're here to talk about, I just want to talk about an issue that this channel and other YouTube channels have been experiencing recently, in case you're not aware of it. What has happened is, over the last number of days, YouTube, most likely through some kind of glitch, has unsubscribed big chunks of people from our channels. Now, normally when this happens, and it's supposed to happen, YouTube will notify us and say, hey, we're cleaning off bot accounts and things like that. But this is not a scenario like that. So the reason I'm bringing it up is, if you already believe you're subscribed or want to be subscribed to the channel, you may want to just double check that you've clicked the subscribe button and are still fully subscribed. Okay, so that being said, let us dive in to what we are here to talk about today. And that is this fellow right here, the Cloister Gargoyle. Now, this is an interesting card for a number of different reasons, okay? Now, first of all, if you're not familiar with what's going on, Magic the Gathering has an upcoming Dungeons & Dragons set, which is literally combining D&D and Magic the Gathering. And in all honesty, they mesh together very, very well. For the longest time, D&D greedily kept some of its really coolest creature types to itself. You want beholders? No, it's for D&D only. But finally, they've opened their arms wide and they're hugging Magic, saying, you may have all the beholders you want, good sir. And this genuinely makes me happy, because I've been playing Dungeons & Dragons and Magic the Gathering for many, many years. And D&D has a lot of awesome, like, just little items and creatures and things like that that go fantastically into Magic. Now, when it comes to gargoyles, we've had gargoyles in Magic since the very, very beginning, right? I mean, they were literally in the first printing of the game. So this isn't a creature type that's showing up into Magic now. That's not the exciting aspect of this card. In fact, this is mostly a run-of-the-mill uncommon. Let's break down what it is. So it's 1 white and 2 for a 0/4. When it enters the battlefield, you venture into the dungeon, and as long as you've completed a dungeon, Cloister Gargoyle gets +3/+0 and has flying. Now, conceptually, this is an interesting idea of showing the two different states that a gargoyle can be in, right? Because traditionally, the most well-known concept of gargoyles is as guardians on buildings, right? They look fairly demonic, let's be real. Gargoyles are ugly, but I think originally the idea behind that was supposed to be they were meant to frighten evil spirits away. I could be wrong, but I think the initial gargoyles that were placed on buildings were done in a superstitious manner. And I'm glad that they did, because it led to a really cool mythology behind the concept of gargoyles, right? The idea of these stone statues that actually come to life. And they just, like, the gargoyles sitting there up on the building, leering down at you, looking like they're ready to leap. It really does give that kind of a vibe. So you have two states. You have the gargoyle as the actual motionless statue variation, and then you have the gargoyle come to life, right? And it flies up off of the building and then swoops down on whoever, like whatever unsuspecting individuals are around, or whoever's violated the temple, whatever it is for that particular flavor, right? Gargoyles aren't inherently evil. Actually, gargoyles, to me, are mostly neutral constructs that are really just designated as guardians for locations, and those could be fair or foul locations, right? So you see this gargoyle, when you originally put it out, it's a 0/4. And that represents to me its inert statue form, right? It's got 4 toughness, which is a considerable amount of toughness, which makes sense for a stone statue. And then once you've completed the dungeon, then it gains +3/+0 and flying, and that's the point where the gargoyle has been animated. And that's an interesting concept. Basically, imagine this gargoyle is literally outside of a dungeon. You complete the dungeon, and then the gargoyle springs to life, maybe as a result of like trying to stop you from leaving with the dungeon's treasure. Although in this case, the gargoyle that we're being shown is actually placed on a religious order's building, because that's what a cloister is, right? A cloister is a building that is filled with religious individuals, okay? So this is going to be the guardian of some religious house, and that makes sense when you look at the casting cost. This is 1 white, right? So this is a white aligned card. It's 1 white and 2 to cast it, but its color is white. It's interesting to note that these old school style frames that Wizards is using, if you're not familiar with what's going on with the frame concept, these are meant to mimic ancient Dungeons and Dragons manuals. So if you have the old school monster manuals, these are the type of drawings that you would see in them. This black and white sort of line drawing with no real color added in. It really, really does a great job of evoking the flavor of old Dungeons and Dragons manuals. If you're somebody who played like first or second edition first or second edition Dungeons and Dragons, you're definitely going to be able to appreciate this. For me, it's really neat. I like the extra details. Like you can see the gargoyle here all squat over like, hey. He looks pretty vicious, let's be real. Like if you look at him, he doesn't really look like a white aligned gargoyle. If you just showed me the artwork and said, what color is this card? I would instantly say that is some kind of black imp, most likely, or theoretically a gargoyle, but it really does give like imp vibes to me, but it also is kind of beefy for an imp. I like the little details in terms of, you can actually see on the type line where it says artifact creature gargoyle, you can see 2 of his toes with their little claws peeking over the edges on the 1 foot and the same on the other side, even overshadowing the letter E there. I like these little details that extend out past the artwork box, but also don't really end up obscuring the words on the card. When they go out and actually cover words, that's when to me it's like, I mean, you can still figure out what it is, but I think that they should always have cards that are clear and legible unless they're doing full art variations. So the ability behind this card, the entering the battlefield, venturing into the dungeon. Obviously, this is where it gets really exciting. The +3/+0 part as a result of going into the dungeon is okay, but it really is, what is venturing into the dungeon in the first place? And actually, I want to take a moment to say that this card may not actually be real. There's a reason I called it a leak instead of a spoiler. Now, this is a very professionally made looking card, so I'm not absolutely saying it's fake, but here's the thing. When I went looking for normally when I grab images for these style of videos, I will go to particular websites like MTG Pics, because they will tend to have a nice quality version of the picture and they'll have trimmed all the edges around and everything like that. But I actually had to do that myself for this because I could only find this referenced in locations like Reddit. None of the official spoiler sites are, well, I mean, I guess you wouldn't really call them official spoiler sites, but none of the official, unofficial spoiler sites that you would normally go to seem to have listed this as a genuine card. So there is the chance that this isn't an actual genuine spoiler card. This may be a well put together fake leak. So when it comes to abilities like the phrasing, venture into the dungeon, that may not be how dungeons work. It may not be the phrase venture into the dungeon, but the dungeon mechanic, dungeons being a part of this upcoming Dungeons and Dragons set, that is 100% confirmed. And the reason I know this is because on the Wizards Play Network website, if you're not familiar with it, the WPN website, or Wizards Play Network, is something specifically used for local game stores, retailers, things like that, to be able to keep up to date with what's going on with Magic the Gathering. So when it comes down to the listing specifically for the upcoming Adventures in the Forgotten Realms pre-release pack release, the items that are listed in the kit include specifically 3 foil double-sided dungeon cards. So we know for a fact that dungeon cards are a real thing. But the person who theoretically made this mock-up, if it's fake, would also be aware that dungeons are a real thing. And this is one of those scenarios where this can either be looked at as, well, of course it's real, look, it references dungeons, or it can just be looked at as, okay, whoever made this did a good job. They already knew what was, what we already knew as fact, and from that point, they're able to build on that to increase your belief, right? I was explaining this actually yesterday in a live stream. The best way to make people believe something is to use what they already think is reality. So people already know we're going to be getting dungeon cards. They just don't know exactly how it's going to be executed. And this little gargoyle here fills in the gap quite nicely, right? The idea of venturing into the dungeon is a really interesting concept. I'm curious as to what the execution of these dungeon cards are going to be, right? Because Wizards has got more explorative when it comes to the way that they are creating these newer sets. Throne of Eldraine, for example, had adventure cards, and the adventure cards were actually going to be separate cards. So you know how the adventure cards now are, one side is a sorcery or instant, the other side is the creature? It wasn't originally intended to be that way. Adventures were meant to be a separate thing that you would actually go on. So I'm getting that this sort of going into the dungeon thing is going to be a similar vibe. So the phrase may not be venture into the dungeon. It may be, but we will definitely be interacting with dungeons in some regard. Now the question becomes, how exactly will this be executed, right? Are the dungeons going to be things that you can put in your deck or in your sideboard? Are we going to have something along the lines of learn? Will the phrase venture into the dungeon actually mean you may go ahead and grab a dungeon card from your sideboard? Because it seems like, due to the fact that Wizards of the Coast has realized that most of their players are casual players playing formats like Commander or Tabletop, I think that the sideboard doesn't matter as much to them as the original idea behind a sideboard was supposed to be, when we were playing in a competitive environment, the sideboard would be the way that I would have answers to problems for my deck. Like, my deck is weak against this particular thing, but unless they're playing it, it doesn't really matter, and my deck is strongest in this configuration. But if they have the Kryptonite from my deck, then I can make these changes from the sideboard, and I have a much better position. So that was the original mentality about sideboards. But we can see Wizards is experimenting a lot with concepts outside of the deck, right? We have recent companion cards. You have what we just talked about on top of that as well. And now you have things like this, where we're going to have double-faced dungeon cards. And the question is, how will these cards operate? Now, I think the most obvious answer is one side will be the dungeon, and the other side will be the reward for the dungeon, right? So the dungeon could be anything. Who knows if they're going to have different difficulties of dungeons? How will we end up with a scenario? Hold on here. Hold on. I didn't turn off the volume on my telephone. Well, that call totally threw me off for a second. Luckily, through the magic of editing, we're right back at it. So, talking about these double-faced dungeon cards and how they're going to operate. Basically, my guess is one side is the challenge, the other side is the reward. That seems quite logical, right? So, on the challenge side, it could be any number of different things. Something as simple as tap 3 creatures, send them into the dungeon. Or it could be something like control a combined total of 10 power or more on all of your creatures. Or have a red, a black, and a green creature, depending on what sort of difficulty they want to include in the dungeon, how tricky they want to make it. That is one way that it could be done. It could also be done in maybe like a saga-like progression where over 3 different turns, you have to do different things. It could involve coin flipping, dice rolling. There's a lot of different ways to create a adventuring into the dungeon vibe. And since it's Dungeons and Dragons, using dice and stuff like that makes perfect sense as well, right? Like, it's just got that vibe to it. And then on the other side of the card, with the reward, there could be a couple of different variations for that, right? You could just flip it over and it could be an artifact. You know what I mean? They could have, like, go to Dambly Bambly's dungeon, and then when you leave, you beat it, you get Dambly Bambly's chalice, and it's like, ooh, look at the chalice that I got. And then you have this artifact that gives you whatever benefits, right? Or it could be something even crazier, where when you go into the dungeon, you gain some kind of magical essence or whatever, and it literally creates an emblem similar to Planeswalkers and generates a benefit for you each turn. And those are just a couple of possibilities. There are obviously more variations that there could be, but off the top of my head, those seem like some really good possibilities. That's just my take on it, all right? So bear in mind that venture into the dungeon may not be the phrasing that's used for it, but dungeons are most assuredly going to be a part of the upcoming D&D set. So, my friends, let me know your thoughts on all of this. List of my top patrons scrolling on by. I want to thank all my patrons for supporting my channel, and I will talk to all of you very soon. In the meantime, I'm going to go play some Chandalar over on my other channel. I'll leave a link to it and to my lore channel here at the end for you if you'd like to check out either. Thanks for coming by. See you next time.